Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Eruvin Daf Samach opens in the middle of a discussion about what happens when you have a wall with ladders set up going over the wall. Does that count as if it is a wall because the street that ends at that wall is blocked by the wall? Or does it count as if there's a door there because the ladders are set up so that you can go right over the wall? So in a sense you can go right through it. The Gemara will discuss that and halacha which is relevant to it. Then the Gemara goes back to our Mishnah and continues its discussion of shitufei mavais and when you have to leave some of the houses out. The Gemara will bring an interesting story with Abaye who was trying to set up an Eruv in a certain village and he had many different discussions with himself back and forth how to do it properly. The Gemara will then rule on the last machlokas in the Mishnah. Then we get to a new Mishnah in our daf, which reintroduces the subject of Eruvin Techumin and goes back to that. So first of all, we're discussing the ladder at the end of the city, and we had just seen that Rav Nachman had said that it has a split halacha. It counts as a wall, and it counts as if there is no wall. This is when you have a ladder at the end of a street. The street ends at a wall, then there's a ladder going over the wall. So Rav Nachman had said, as far as the halacha of whether you consider it to be a wall, whether you consider it to be a doorway, so that the street would be a street with an entrance on both ends, and the city would be considered having a Rosh Hashanah in it, that you wouldn't have to leave some of the houses out of the Eruv, the Shetufim Mavais. So as far as that's concerned, it is considered to be open. But it is also considered to be a wall as far as the halacha of Eruv Chatzeros. Which halacha is that? Now we know if you have two Chatzeros that are near each other, and they have an entrance that goes from one to the other, if the Chatzeros join together and you consider them to be one Chatzer, then if one of the groups opts out of the Eruv and doesn't join with the Eruv, then it is forbidden for everybody to carry in those Chatzers, because the Chatzer doesn't have everybody joining the Eruv Chatzeros. A Chatzer with not everybody joining the Eruv Chatzeros is invalid. On the other hand, if we view it as two separate Chatzeros, then the people from one Chatzer don't have to join the Eruv Chatzeros of the other one because they're not part of that Chatzer. So what happens when you have a wall between the two Chatzeros with a ladder over it? So Rav Nachman says you get to choose whether you want it to be considered to be open, and therefore they could join into one Eruv Chatzeros. They could make one joint Eruv Chatzeros for both Chatzeros if they want to, or they could choose to say that it's considered to be two separate Chatzeros, and therefore if one Chatzer doesn't join the Eruv, the other one is still okay. They don't have to get these people to join. Their self-contained Eruv Chatzeros is good. So Yomar has a question on this. This is not true, because you see a similar case. You see a case where there is a Chatzer joining a porch. Now, a porch is very similar to a Chatzer. It's just raised. It is a Chatzer on the upper story. It's for the people who live in the upper floor. Now, the way that this Chatzer and porch was arranged, there was a ladder going from the porch to the Chatzer, and that was actually the exit for the people who lived on the second floor. They would go out into the porch, and then they would go down the ladder, out to the Chatzer, and then out to Rosh Hashanah. That's how they traveled. Now, what was the halacha of this ladder here that was set up there? So Rav Nachman had said, the halacha is that it's considered to be combined with the Chatzer, and if you don't have everybody joining the Eruv Chatzeros, it's a problem, and nobody's allowed to carry, and it's considered combined unless you have a small frame, a door frame that's built over the divider between the Chatzer and the porch. So you see that Rav Nachman was clearly saying that a ladder counts as a doorway. So how could he say that you have the option, when it's between two Chatzeros, you have the option of deciding if you want it to be a doorway or if you want it to be a wall without a doorway? Here he's saying that you have to consider it to be a doorway. The only way out of it is if you have a frame around it. So the Gemara says this is different. It's not a problem. Here we're referring to where the mirpeset, the porch was less than 10 tfachim above the level of the Chatzer, and therefore it's counted as if it's completely open, and that's why you have to have a door frame there. So the Gemara says less than 10 tfachim, how does that help you? You still have two Chatzeros that are open to each other. What's it going to help you if you put the frame there then? The frame there isn't going to help you if you have two completely open Chatzeros, one to the next, and anything which is, if the height difference is less than 10 tefachim, it's considered to be like they're on the same level halachically, and they're fully open to each other. So Gemara says what actually happened here was that although they weren't on the same level, and the level was less than 10 tefachim, but there was a wall actually surrounding the porch, and it left a 10 amma wide gap only. So that wall was there. In a situation where you have a wall like that just leaves a gap, so there, since it's different heights also, its halacha depends on whether they put the frame there or not. If they put the frame there, then it's considered like they set themselves apart. Their porch is not part of the chutzner below. And if they didn't put the frame there, then they are part of the chutzner below, and therefore they have to join its Erev Chatzeres for the Erev Chatzeres to be valid. Now this statement of Rav Nachman here with the porch was said in the name of Shmuel. The Gemara now brings that very self-same discussion as a very similar kasha and the same back and forth on a different statement of Shmuel. This is Rabbi Yehuda quoting Shmuel, who said that if you have a wall with a bunch of ladders lined up, and the ladders are on both sides of the wall, and they're actually lined up for a length of more than 10 amos, so it counts as if there's a complete wall there. So the Gemara asks, how could they count as a complete wall? Same kasha. Here we have the case where you said that it doesn't count as a wall unless you put a door frame there. Otherwise, the chutzner counts as if it's combined with the porch. And the Gemara again says the level was less than 10 tefachim. The Gemara again says if so, then the frame won't help you. The Gemara answers, same answer. The situation was that it was actually walled in on all sides except for 10 amos, and therefore that's why the door frame makes all the difference in the world in that halacha. Okay, now the Gemara has an incident here that happened. We're now going back to the halacha of leaving some of the houses out of a shitufim mavos. Again, we're saying that when you make a shitufim mavos for one large city, if it's a city of a Rishus HaRabim, then the point of having shitufim mavos required is so that people realize that mavos are different than Rishus HaRabim, and Rishus HaRabim you can't just walk in and out. Of course, if you're going to make a very large shitufim mavos, nobody will even know about it, and then we'll just be back to the original problem of people not knowing that there was a halacha that Rosh Hashanah can't just be carried into and out of. So in order to avoid that, the Gemara said in a large city, which is Rosh Hashanah, you have to leave some of the houses out of the original shitufei mavos, and they aren't allowed to carry with everybody else, and that way people will realize the only reason you're allowed to carry here is because there's a shitufei mavos. Why don't you need shitufei mavos? Obviously mavos are different than Rosh Hashanah, and Rosh Hashanah you're never allowed to carry. So the story that happened over here was that the people from the town of Kakunoi came to Rav Yosef and they said, can you send us somebody who knows what he's doing and can set up a shitufim mavos for our city? So Rav Yosef appointed his Talmud Abai. He said, Abai, do me a favor, go set up an area of shitufim mavos there. Just make sure that you do it correctly so that the people in the Beis Medrash shouldn't hear complaints afterwards that it wasn't done right. So Abai went and he found that the task was not quite as simple as it looked. The first thing he had to do was, because it was a large city of Rosh Hashanah, he had to choose houses that he was going to leave out of the Erev. He wanted to leave some of them out. So he found that there was a row of houses on the riverbank, and then their doors only opened to the river, didn't open to the city. So he said, okay, this is great. They anyway can't use the rest of the city. Their doors only open to the river. So these can be the houses left out of the Erev. And then he said to himself, hold on a second, maybe they can't be the houses left out of the Erev, because the houses left out of the Erev have to be somebody who's negea to the Erev. It could have been in the Erev, but we're leaving him out as a sign. And people should remember that there's a shitufei mavos over here. But if these people are never even part of the Erev in the first place because their doors don't open to it, so that doesn't serve the purpose. So in order to be able to use these houses, they have to make windows that they could climb through to get from their houses to the rest of the city. And he says, you know what? Maybe not. Maybe I don't need the windows. Because I have a kind of case where houses that weren't relevant to the Erev were the ones that were left out. It was the case of Rabbi Bar Avua, who made an Erev in the city of Mechuzah, and he made a separate Erev for each neighborhood itself. And he said that it's okay, they're not considered to be one giant neighborhood because there are trenches between the neighborhoods that contain food for cows, and therefore people couldn't go from one to the other. The trenches were in the way. And therefore, each neighborhood was considered left out of the Eruv of the other neighborhood. But they couldn't walk to the other neighborhood. So obviously, you see, it's not a problem that they couldn't naturally walk there. It's still good enough to be that those are the ones that are left out. And therefore, here, I could use these houses. I don't have to make windows. Then Abai said to himself, you know what, maybe it's not true. Maybe I can't bring a proof from there, because over there, they could have theoretically walked from the roofs. The roofs, you could walk from one roof to another roof over the trenches with the food for the cows. So therefore, it's not really good proof. Maybe I should make the windows. Then he said, you know what? I don't think I need to make the windows, because I have a different proof. I have the case of Mar Pupidsa of Pompadisa that left storehouses out of the Shitufei Mavais, and that's what he left out. And over there, the storehouses, there wasn't even anybody who lived there, so it's not relevant to the Erev Chatzeres or Shitufei Mavais altogether, and yet still those are the ones that he left out. So after this whole discussion back and forth, Abai said, now I see what Rav Yosef meant when he said make sure you do it correctly, so they won't complain. In the base medrash, it was all this whole discussion that he was probably referring to. Okay, the Gemara now goes back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah said if you have a large city, that's Rosh Hashanah, you have to leave out a few houses. It was in Machokis how big that area you have to leave out has to be. When said according to Rav Yehuda, it has to be like a city called Chadasha, which is in the region of Yehuda, that has 50 residents in it. So the Gemara quotes a Brisa, which fleshes this out. Rav Yehuda says that there was a city in Yehuda called Chadasha. It had exactly 50 residents, men, women, children, altogether totaled 50. And when the Chachamim made Shitufei Mavais, that was the city that they left out. It was actually it was a neighborhood within a larger city, and that was the one that they left out. Now the Gemara asks, let's say you want to make an Erev Chatzeres or Shitufei Mavais for Chadasha itself. Do you have to leave something smaller out of the 50? So this is what he's talking about. Chadasha was part of a bigger city. The other larger area was left out of the Chadasha Shitufei Mavais. For sure, that itself is considered to be the area that you leave out. What's the question? He says, no, I'm asking if you have a big city that then shrinks, and it itself becomes a similar size to the city of Chadasha. I mean, it gets so small that it only has 50 residents. Do you have to still leave part of it out of the Shitufei Mavais? So that's a machlekes Rav Huna and Rav Yehuda. One says you have to, one says you don't. The Gemara doesn't specify which one. Okay, now Reb Shimon argues in this halacha. Rav Yehuda says you don't have to leave out 50 residents. All you have to leave out is 3 courtyards with 2 houses each. Rav Chama bar Giora says the name of Rav, the halacha is like Reb Shimon. Rav Yitzchak said actually the halacha is less. All you have to do is leave out 1 house or 1 chutzner. The Gemara says leave out 1 chutzner. What, without a house? How's that going to work? Nobody lives there. The Gemara says no, it means 1 house which is connected to 1 chutzner together. Now the Gemara, this is not the halacha, but the Gemara says that Abaye asked Rav Yosef, where did Rav Yitzchak get this from? He had a Kabbalah or he thought it misvara? So Rav Yosef said, what do you care? It's not the halacha anyway. So he said, what do you mean? I have to understand what I learned, whether it's the halacha or not. Now begin the Mishnah, which goes back to the halachas of Eruvin Tchumen. Let's remind ourselves that an Eruv Tchumen is when you choose a spot other than where you actually are to be your center of Tchum. That means that that spot becomes your permanent residence for Shabbos, and your Tchum is surrounded around that spot 2,000 amos in every direction. You could be on the edge of that circle, and therefore you would be able to walk 2,000 amos to that new center, and then 2,000 amos past that, of course, you wouldn't be able to walk any distance at all in your opposite direction because you're now standing on the edge of the circle. So what happened over here was they have somebody who's in the eastern side of the city or on the western side of the city, and he says to his son, make me an Eruv on the other opposite end of the city. So the Mishnah says the following thing: if his Eruv is too far for him to get to, meaning he's outside of the Tchum of that Eruv, then that Eruv can't count for him. And it doesn't count for him. Instead, he defaults to his own house, assuming that his house is within 2,000 amos of where he is. Remember, he has to be within 2,000 amos of his own Eruv because he has to be able to be within that circle. His Eruv becomes the center of the 2,000 amma circle, so his new Tchum is 2,000 amos in every direction of his Eruv. If he's outside that circle, then it can't be his center because he's not part of the circle. So therefore, if the Erev that was set up for him is outside, if he's outside the Tchum of that Erev, it doesn't count as his Erev at all, and therefore he defaults back to his house, assuming he is within 2,000 Amos of his house. If, however, he is within 2,000 Amos of the Erev, and he's not within 2,000 Amos of the house, then the Erev does work for him. So again, he kind of gets the best of both worlds. Whichever one works for him, whichever one he's within the Tchum of, that becomes his Erev, and his Tchum is 2,000 Amos in every direction of that. Now, if he sets up his Erev within what the Mishnah has called earlier the Iburoi Shel Ir, that is the expansion part of the city, that is any structures within 70 and 2/3 Amos of the city itself, which counts as part of the city. So if he puts his Erev in there, then he doesn't gain the thing, because he's anyway not going to start measuring his 2,000 Amos from that spot, because it's within the city and it's within the expansion of the city. Anyway, you start measuring the Tchum past that. So by setting up an Erev there, he's done exactly nothing. If, however, he has placed his Erev 1 Amma further than the borders of the city, according to the halachas of Ibur, then he's gained at least 1 Amma in that direction, but he's lost 1 Amma in the opposite direction. Whichever you lose in one direction, you lose in the opposite direction, because you don't get a bigger Tchum, you just move the center of your Tchum to where you put the Erev. Okay, that ends the Mishnah. The Gemara now attempts to understand the Mishnah. The Gemara, interestingly, had some confused, apparently, understandings of the Mishnah. First of all, when the Mishnah described that somebody's on the east, and he tells the son to make the Erev to the west, so the Gemara is confused. How could we understand the case that could be that the Erev is further than his house, because he's in the east, his house is in the center, and the Erev is on the west, so the Erev is further from him than his house is. But how could his house be further than him? If he's on the east of his house, and the Erev is to the west of his house, how could the Erev be further away than his house? So Gemara says, no, he's not east of his house, and the Erev is west of his house. He's east of his son, and he's telling his son to make his Erev to the west of his son. Well, his house is actually all the way back to his own east. His house is totally out of the picture in the opposite direction altogether. So we're all lined up in a row, east to west. House, then him, then his son, then the Erev. That's what it means. So which one is he closer to? He's midway between his house and his Erev. So he could be closer to one or closer to the other. It could be either way. Now Rabbi Yitzchak says it doesn't have to be the way. It could be that he is east of his house and he's east of his Erev, but it could still be further to the house than to the Erev. If there's angles, they're not due east. It's set up like a triangle, him in the east, and then to the west, his house and his Erev, and one could be further away than the other, even though they are both to his west. The house could be further, or the Erev could be further, depending on which angle is taken and which angle is further. Okay, next, the Mishnah said that if he sets up his Erev 1 Amma outside the Tchum, then he only gains 1 Amma. So Gemara, and he loses 1 Amma in the opposite direction. The Gemara says, how could he set up an Erev outside the Tchum? We already said you can't get to an Erev that's outside your Tchum. If you're outside the Tchum and the Erev is outside your Tchum, you're outside the Erev's Tchum, you can't get to each other, it's no good. The Gemara says, what do you mean outside the Tchum? We meant outside the borders of the city, within the Tchum. It was outside the borders of the city, so he's expanded, he's moved his Erev center from being the entire city to being 1 Amma further in that direction. So he gets 1 extra Amma, he can travel in that direction. He loses 1 Amma in the opposite direction. The Gemara says, hold on a second. He doesn't lose an Amma in the opposite direction. He loses sometimes thousands of Ammas. He used to have the entire city and then 2,000 Ammas surrounding the city in every direction. Now he's moved his Erev to outside the city. He just gets 2,000 Ammas in every direction from the Erev. So if he's moved it, let's say 1 Amma to the west of the city, he only gets 2,000 Ammas to the east of that. That'll end in the middle of the city somewhere. He'll lose the rest of the city. He could have had the whole city. He loses a lot more than 1 Amma. So Gemara says, well, not necessarily. It depends how big the city is. If the city is all within his 2,000 Ammas from the Erev, then the halacha is that it doesn't count. The city, you don't count the city, you ignore the city and you start counting the 2,000 Ammas again on the other side of the city. If, however, the Erev, the 2,000 Ammas ends somewhere in the middle of the city, then you do count to the middle of the city and you stop in the middle wherever the 2,000 Ammas end. So it could be that he'll lose, or it could be that it won't. Depends if the entire city is contained within his new tchum or not. And the Gemara quotes Rav Idi quoting Rav Yeshua ben Levi, who says that this is the halacha, that when you're counting an Erev from somewhere outside the city, and you're counting a tchum from an Erev that was made outside of a city, and the tchum passes into the city, so you only get as far as the Erev goes, not the entire city, unless the entire city is all within the Erev. Then not only do you get the whole city because it's within the Tchum, you get even more than that because you skip the city when you're counting the 2,000 Amos, and you don't count it at all. And you, let's say it's 1,000 Amos to get to the edge of the city, and then the city is less than 1,000 Amos, so then you pick up on the other side of the city, counting the rest of your 1,000 Amos. Now, Rav Idi said that the truth is that this doesn't make sense. It's Direi Nevius. It's prophecy, because there's no explanation for this. Why should there be? Why should we count the city if the Erev ends in it, and not count it if the Erev goes beyond it? Why should we not count the city all of a sudden? Doesn't make sense. So Rava said, I'm going to prove to you that we do have this halacha. It does appear in a brisa. I'm going to show it to you in a brisa here. He proceeds to do so, and Rav Idi defends his position, and that will be Daf Samach.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.